Welcome back to the channel, everyone. For those of you who watched my recent review of the Silent Hill 2 remake, which presumably means you got the joke in the title, you'll recall that I said I wanted to dedicate more time to doing a more direct comparison between the zones and environments between the original and the remake to show off some of the changes. On top of that, I'll talk about some of what I liked and, where applicable, things I didn't like. I'm not really sure how long this miniseries is going to be. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed before, but I can be a little long-winded at times. Shocking, I know. It surprises me too. I just hope you were sitting down for that revelation. So, as a quick introduction, for those of you who may not have watched the review or seen anything about the remake, one of the details that was released about the game before launch was that it would be twice as long as the original. The story wasn't expanded, aside from a couple new interactions with James and Angela and Maria, not all together for reasons many of you already know. If that's not what extended the gameplay, what did? Well, I'm sure there are those who have compared the size of the maps in the original versus the remake and come up with more precise measurements for just how much larger the maps are. I don't have that sort of data, but what I can do is go over how the game expanded on existing areas through the use of newly accessible areas within existing areas, and how the implementation of new puzzles and key items helped to pad the game time. I do want to be clear about one thing on the outset. Padding is not always a bad thing. Considering how many people were complaining about the price point, I can't imagine anyone would be happier if the remake hadn't expanded on the different zones of Silent Hill and given it more runtime. People tend to be more picky with where they spend their money on games these days, inflation being what it is. Games like Silent Hill 2 charged full price when they released as new back in 2001, and the game itself only took you about 8 hours to play through on standard for the first time. Now, to be fair, there was also a ranking system and certain unique weapons you could get for completing the game with a perfect ranking on hard mode, assuming you were a major masochist, so there was certainly replayability. Even though the ranking system is absent from the remake, as is the hyperspray, the harder difficulty still exists and puzzle difficulty can still be adjusted, but I can understand why some may see the remake having fewer reasons to play it again after getting all the endings or gathering all the trophies. Any challenge you want to make is for yourself alone, which some may find disappointing, and I completely understand that. Still, from what I can find online, the original released for somewhere around $39.99 or $49.99. Adjusting for inflation, that was somewhere between $70 and $90 today, rounding off of course. As I mentioned in my review, that means that the remake's pricing is actually on par for how it was when buying the original. I wouldn't recommend trying to get a copy of the original today, since that can run you several $100s, if you can find one. Hence why the enhanced PC edition is so popular, and why I highly recommend it if you want to play the original. So, having said that, I can't imagine anyone being thrilled with the price point being what it is now, had the developers not added some new content, even if the replayability may be arguably less than the original without the ranking system. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get into the meat of it. The game starts out the exact same way, with James having to run through a long trail through the forest in order to get to the town proper. The well is still there, providing the player with their first save point, and the remake keeps the line about feeling like something is groping around in his skull. One of the first things players of the original may notice is the sound design. I've seen it mentioned elsewhere that the original Silent Hill 2 in many places had ambient sound effects that were randomized in many locations so that players wouldn't always know if they were remembering things correctly from a previous playthrough. And that may be true, but every time I went through the forest in the original, there was always some strange noise you could hear off screen that sounded like some of the creepy monsters in the town. It was a way to clue the players in early on that something wasn't quite right, though anyone who played the first game already knew that. It's possible my memory is a bit hazy, but I don't recall hearing these particular effects anywhere else in the town proper or anywhere else you visit. Again, I may just not be remembering. In the remake, the trip plays out the same for the most part, but keen observers will notice that those sound effects are missing. The sound design, I still think works really well, but those otherworldly sounds are gone. I don't think that ruins anything or detracts from it, since the atmosphere still, I think, felt very tense. It almost felt too quiet, if you know what I mean. The sound of your footsteps in the forest and the squelching noise running through the puddles in comparison to the stillness and the fog around you feels suitably creepy. And to be honest, I'm not sure which I prefer. Now, playing through the original the first time, I don't remember if I noticed the sounds off camera, or if I did they unnerve me? Again, that was nearly 20 years ago, and at the time, I only played it once. Playing through it again, I still found the sound effects to be serviceably creepy, but playing it through a third time to get footage, which didn't always capture the audio, unfortunately, due to OBS glitching out for some reason, I started to wonder if it was necessary, since, again, I couldn't recall those effects being anywhere else. I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. Now, the remake adds a new little tutorial here, which has players go through their first building to find a key to the gate that leads into town. And this is a nice, clever way of having players do something they'll be doing a lot of, and it also starts to drip feed the players the idea that things have been vacated. And right through there, you find one of the new collectibles in the game, which is really just an Easter egg that shows scenery or key items from the original. These actually feed into a theory that James is experiencing Silent Hill in a loop over and over again, but that's an entirely different discussion for another time, and I'll probably touch on that when I talk about the characters themselves in another little series. Anyway, going into town, things play out a little differently. The maps themselves are the same, so the layout of the streets are identical, but there are a couple new buildings you can go in, like the flower shop, which allows you to find another collectible, notes. Notes are there for both world building and giving clues to puzzles and locations to go visit. The quality of these notes varies from being interesting to being somewhat pedantic and repetitive. Did you know weird crap was happening in town? Well, if you didn't, the notes will tell you. I'm also somewhat ambivalent about some of the notes themselves. Many of them are just written by people who are apparently experiencing supernatural things in town and seeing monsters as well and trying to get out. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, since we know other people have been in town and experienced these things before James ever got there, and with the shenanigans the Order was up to in other games, especially with what happened to Alessa, it's pretty safe to assume the residents of Silent Hill had seen some stuff, to put it mildly. Other notes, again, lean into the time loop theory, which we'll cover some other time. And collecting these notes actually contributes to the Archivist trophy, which requires you to collect all of them in a single playthrough, but if you explore everywhere before moving on, you should be able to find most of them without needing much help. James also tracks down the first lying figure, much the same way he did in the original, only instead of following it into a boarded up tunnel where the thing was literally 2 feet away from him and he's completely oblivious to it. Now James goes into a house by crawling through a hole in the garage door, which also gives a tutorial on looking for strips of white cloth to indicate areas of access. A change of pace from the typical yellow paint we tend to see in games these days. After getting the radio and hearing the message, James then goes into the town to figure out how to get into the next area. There are a few buildings of interest the players will need to explore before being able to move on. In the original, all the player needed to do was run up Martin Street, find a corpse with a key on it for the Woodside Apartments, and then proceed to said apartments. Things aren't so quick this time around. Instead of making a beeline to Martin Street, players will need to explore a familiar location, Neely's Bar, as well as Texan Cafe and 2 new locations not present in the original, Saul Street Apartments and Groovy Music. Saul Street Apartments is a fairly small location, and going there will let you acquire one of the key items needed for solving a puzzle in Neely's Bar involving a record player where you need to superglue a vinyl record together. Now, I realize this is just a game, but as someone who grew up when vinyl records were still a thing back in the early 80s, though come to think of it, they've made a comeback in recent years, I'm pretty sure a superglued record wouldn't play as well in a jukebox as it does in this game, nor would it cause it to explode. Then again, the town does weird crap all the time, so we'll just chalk it up to the town's supernatural abilities. Anyway, solving this finally grants you access to a parking lot, which lets you finally grab the Woodside Apartments key. You'll recall that I mentioned someone criticizing the remake for having this key clearly labeled, but what else would you expect the game to do? give you a nondescript key, and then force you to try it on every locked building in town until finding the right door? Well, of course the game is going to direct you to where you need to go next. All of this also helps teach players that whenever you find an item of interest or a clue to somewhere interesting, James will mark it on his map for you to check out whenever you're able to get to it. This is true of the notes you find throughout town, including Neely's bar. Points of interest are marked, and you have to figure out how to get there and grab what is most likely a key item. This becomes a little more complicated once you hit sections that are indoors, since they tend to have a lot more locked off areas, and you need to figure out how to either unlock the door with a key or find a pathway around to unlock the door from the other side. Anyway, after grabbing the apartment key, a storm flares up, the fog gets heavier, and more lying figures pop out of nowhere to get in the way, though fortunately you can run past them and head to the next area. Oh, I should add that next to the apartments is another one of those little Easter eggs where you can see the dumpster from the original game's apartment complex. Also, one of the other great things is that there are a lot of breakable windows in storefronts and on cars that often allow you to grab healing items and ammo. In fact, if you really want to have current day politics in it, you can have James bust out the windows in multiple vehicles, including cop cars, and go full ACAB, just like the mostly peaceful riots of yesteryear. Black lives!
That's right.
That's right!
Matter!
That's right! That's right! That's right! That's right! That's right!
Anyway, the apartment complex is the first real zone we have in the game, just like the original, and the layout is immediately different. The apartment building was very limited in the original, but all of the areas were, so that's no shock. The original had just a few hallways you could run down along with the pool area, and that was about it. That's not to say the new apartment complex deviates too terribly from that. The pool area still exists, and as per usual with Silent Hill games, there are a lot of locked doors. However, there are more areas where you can crawl from one room into the next, or even go out on balconies in order to circumvent certain sealed off areas. One of the things I mentioned in my review is that the town of Silent Hill feels much bigger and much more like a real town. Don't get me wrong, for the hardware limitations of its time, the PS2 did a pretty solid job of depicting an abandoned town, but now that processing power has gotten so much greater, the developers were able to make these buildings feel much more real. They feel like locations you could go visit in real life and see where the developers mimic the structure of the building. There are new rooms that are accessible for sure, including a new set of puzzles and collectible items. Most notable is going to be the room with drawings all over it. This one involves a safe in the middle of the room, and you have to follow the hints in a poem to figure out the combination. Solving the puzzle involves looking around the scrawled lines and drawings all over the wall to find 3 numbers, seeing what they're associated with, and then correlating it with the poem. It's not terribly difficult, but if you've played Silent Hill games before, you should be used to this sort of thing. Of course, if you want it to be more challenging, you can always set the puzzle difficulty to the hardest setting, which I may end up doing at some point just to see how different it is. I remember one puzzle in Silent Hill 3 being particularly gruesome on a harder puzzle setting, and that was just to figure out the number order on a keypad. I have no idea how much harder this can be in the remake, but I would highly recommend checking it out if you find these too simple. Speaking of layout changes, the original puzzles are still here, but they don't quite play out the same way. I referenced this in my review video, but I'll break it down a little more here. You may recall in the original that when you gain access to the clock room after seeing Pyramid Head behind the bars at the end of the hall, something which remains in this version as well, you slide through a hole in the wall, and one of the next major scenes is with Pyramid Head and the mannequins. Both of these are in the remake, but they play out slightly differently. In the original, the second half of Woodside Apartments begins a puzzle involving collecting 3 coins, which then go to a puzzle involving placing them in the right slots based on a short story. While collecting these, James ends up crossing over to the Blue Creek apartment buildings next door, where he meets Eddie for the first time, and then shortly after runs into Angela again, where they have a scene and you collect another coin. Ultimately, after solving this puzzle, you get the Lynn House key, which allows you to get the fire escape key, which lets you then open the fire escape door, which launches you into your first confrontation with Pyramid Head. You can either shoot him in the face a few times and speed things up, or just avoid him for a few minutes until the sirens call him off. Again, all of this is preserved in the remake, but arranged differently. Eddie is actually located in room 116 of Woodside this time around instead of Blue Creek, but the interaction is the same. As for the coin puzzle, it's found in the office of the apartment complex in the first floor of the building. In fact, you can find it soon after entering the building. The coins are found in the same way. There's a coin in the pool area inside the baby carriage, there's a coin lodged in the trash chute, but the third coin, instead of being with Angela, is found in the safe in the room with all the wall scribbles. The puzzle itself follows the same format. There are several coin slots, and you need to read the story to figure out where to place them. The image on the box gives you clues where to place them, but now you also have to pay attention to the other side of the coins, and will need to use both symbols on each coin where applicable. Solving this allows you to access a previously locked room, and entering this room triggers the aforementioned scene with Pyramid Head. I do want to mention just one thing here. There were quite a few people I saw saying that this scene had been censored because Pyramid Head was clearly violating the mannequins in the original. Masahiro Ito has denied that this was the intent behind the scene. According to Ito, Pyramid Head is simply trying to remove these figures from James's presence and psyche in order to force him to confront the truth, but James is unwilling to do this, and so he shoots the gun to make Pyramid Head wander off. In response, people have pointed out inconsistencies with Ito's statements about when the original game took place, saying it was in the 70s or 80s, which, if I remember, is at odds with official information about when it took place. Take all of that for what you will. Let's take Ito at his word, though, and that in the scene, though there are clearly sexualized components to the mannequins, this sort of violence is not Pyramid Head's purpose in the game. He is, as we all know, the representation of James's guilt and desire to be punished. As far as I know, Ito has denied that he has any connection to James's repressed sexual desires in any way. That's not his purpose at all. Again, it's hard to fight these allegations when you have scenes like this as well from the original. But allow me to present a counterexample. This is an excerpt from the final battle theme against Necron in Final Fantasy IX. You can hear the anguished moaning of souls in the track. I think one could argue, without really stretching things, that the sound the lying figure makes in the original is not intended to be a moan of pleasure, but agony as it's being killed. In comparison, the remake version alters this scene to where you just see Pyramid Head dragging away the dead body. Again, this is why people claim the scene from the closet and the scene here are censored. However, what if this was a suggestion that Ito made to Bloober Team so as to avoid this sort of confusion in the remake, and avoid players thinking Pyramid Head is doing something that was not intended? As Ito says, abuse does not mean rape. So we either take Ito at his word and accept that maybe this was a change based on his input since he was the one who created the characters and monsters, or you assume that this was all because Bloober Team was just being censorious. Given how they handled Abstract Daddy, I'm more inclined to think this was probably Ito's suggestion. Ultimately, you have to decide whether you think this alters anything. Even if you think Ito is just retconning things, it boils down to whether having this scene being as explicit as it was in the original or being more subtle and leaving it to the player's imagination is better. I think both communicate the same disturbing imagery in different ways. I know Ito has also sort of bemoaned how PH has been treated in the films and other games, so I don't necessarily have any reason to think he's lying about what he thinks about this scene either. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there since I'm sure others have talked about it as evidence of the game being woke, and I'm not so sure that's why this modification was made. Getting back to the comparison. After witnessing the scene with Pyramid Head, players are then able to go over to the Blue Creek Apartments, and this is where the layout changes the most. For the first time in Silent Hill 2 Remake, we get to see the Otherworld, and it is glorious. That's actually one of the gripes I had with the original game. In both Silent Hill 1 and 3, we get to see the rusted and blood-covered environments of the Otherworld a few times, and each time was deeply unsettling and disturbing. In Silent Hill 2, we really only ever saw the alternate version of the hospital. Arguably, the town after the hospital and up until entering the Historical Society was altered, but aside from it being nighttime, everything looked basically the same. Other than that, we don't see the Otherworld. Or do we? If you know what I mean, we'll get there eventually. In any case, I absolutely loved the fact that Blue Creek Apartments were transformed into the Otherworld. On top of that, there is now a new variant of lying figures that spits acid at you and, when it dies, shoots out a geyser of acid into the air. You have to wait a few seconds for this to dissipate before progressing through, assuming you can get around it, or else you'll take damage. This isn't usually an issue, but if you're unlucky enough to get into close quarters combat with these things and another enemy, then you can easily get overwhelmed, since you'll either have to run through it, or you'll just get stuck in it entirely. I actually didn't notice this at first, but it didn't take long to figure it out. I got killed pretty quickly after getting into this area because of that and getting jumped by a mannequin, but once you get used to how the enemy works, it isn't that bad. The layout of Blue Creek is even more radically different than the first set of apartments was from the original. This is where the clock puzzle is located, and, as I mentioned in the review, you have to find the different pieces of the clock face in order to complete and solve the puzzle. As much as I love the Otherworld version of Blue Creek, this is also where the game has its first venture into the trope of having a bunch of dead bodies around that just reanimate later to be annoying. Now, I get it, it's supposed to add tension, but if you've played enough games like this, then you know exactly what's going to happen. You'll get a key item, have to backtrack through this area, and after one particular item, or every item, you'll have to face more and more of these dumb things until you've killed them all for realsies. As I said before, it's not so much tense as it is an annoying inconvenience. Harder difficulties may make it more of a threat, but that's assuming you're unable to avoid running around them and still get to where you're going and avoid combat. As part of the clock puzzle, there are 2 other doors nearby that are locked until you begin assembling the face. Each time you grab another piece of the clock, the room deteriorates a little further, since this is the only room that looks somewhat normal in comparison to the rest of the corrupted apartment complex. Upon completing the puzzle, the final locked door will open, which allows you to go and have your first fight with Pyramid Head. Just like in the original, you have 2 options. Shoot him to speed up the timer, or just run around and avoid him. I actually wasn't sure if running around in circles would work like it did in the original, but it absolutely does. From the time the opening cutscene ends until the sirens start is about 3 minutes, which I think was about the same time frame from the original. It's up to you how you want to play it out, but you can avoid using any ammo here, which will be useful for stockpiling later. After completing the fight, you exit back out into the town where you soon have your meeting with Laura sitting on the wall, and then you soon enter the waterfront where you meet Maria for the first time as well. Given how long this is already getting, I'm actually going to take a break here, and we'll pick up with any differences beginning from escorting Maria around town and getting to the hospital. I considered going through Brookhaven before ending, but the script for this is already about half as long as the review, and that's before doing any recording or editing, so I'll cut it here. Well, I say that, but I do want to quickly showcase some of the Easter eggs that reference the original. I already mentioned there was the block tunnel near the beginning, which was located after the ranch. This is where James got the first radio and encountered the first lying figure in the original. There's another locked gate on Vox Road, which actually led to the first tunnel we saw in the original. Up on Martin Street, there's a huge blood stain on the ground, which players will recognize as a spot where you originally collected the apartment key. I also mentioned the dumpster outside the apartments, which is a reference to where you originally collected the old man coin in the original, and this is also where you first read about Walter Sullivan. Running all the way down to Cat Street, you'll find the graffiti that said, "The door that wakes in darkness, opening into nightmares." It's covered up here now, but it becomes visible later on after leaving the hospital when you're working your way towards the Historical Society. Inside the apartment complex, there are wall scratches in room 213, which is where the original wall clock puzzle was located, and in room 110 you'll find the original coin puzzle broken to pieces. And lastly, once you solve the clock puzzle in the apartments and are on your way to the last door to fight Pyramid Head, you'll come across the dead body of a lying figure in the stairwell, which is of course a reference to the original location of the same fight and the figure that was killed in the stairwell, the same scene we looked at earlier. Well, that's going to do it for now. I hope this helped showcase some of the differences in more detail, and if you were undecided on whether or not the game looked worth it, I hope it gave you more to think about in order to make your decision. I'll be back soon to continue showcasing the changes, and hopefully we can make it through escorting Mary until at least the Historical Society. We'll see. Until then, you all take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.